All right, guys, welcome to this month's video. Today, I am in the south of Poland. There's this big open body of water. There are some beautiful hills that are starting to get some fall foliage, and there's a really nice and interesting pattern of light and shadow on those hills. And I don't think I have an example of some distant hills such as these yet, so that's going to be a fun example for this video to show you guys how I tackle this subject matter. I am taking out my brushes. As always, I'm using mostly bristle brushes, and I'll probably get into some of my sable brushes towards the end. I squeezed out some paint. There are some colors that I'm going to rely heavily on and some colors that I'm probably not going to use as much. I didn't really feel the need to squeeze out any variety. All these greens, all these blues, I'm going to be mixing them. And I also didn't feel the need to squeeze out any of my cad yellow lemon. So other than that, I've got my cad yellow, medium, orange, red, quinacridone magenta, ultramarine, cobalt, ivory, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, a little mud, titanium white for the day. And I also have a toned canvas. You guys could see just how not white this canvas is. So this is some white on my palette knife on the same plane. This is probably like a value 3 about. There are a few decisions that we have to start from the get. We have to ask ourselves in the composition, what is our painting about? This is going to be a painting about these hills across this lake. It's going to be about the varying foliage and the varying lights and shadows and a little bit of the reflections, but that's what the painting is going to be about. I don't want to include too much of the sky. I don't want to include too much of the water. I don't want to create a flag painting, which is just 3 even bands running across this rectangle. I want to have one thing take priority. That is going to be this mountain. The first step, like always, is to tackle some of the drawing and find the big proportions. So I'm going to put in, I think this is where I'll want the water line of these mountains on the bottom, because I'm going to approximately want some reflections coming in. And I'm also going to want to have this pretty high up. So one of the rules of composition is having variety. You want to have variety in your masses, in your shapes, in your proportions. If this is going to be my water, I want my sky mass to either be bigger or smaller. The second we have any 2 points, the rest of our proportions are locked in. When I had this straight line, where exactly the proportions of the top of this mountain range are going to be, that was not settled yet. But the second I have a point, well, if this mountain's going to be up here, I need to immediately start considering my heights and my widths, my largest proportions, because if I get those, everything else will fall into place. Whenever we're doing measurements and we're taking measurements and dropping them directly from life down to here, I always find that there's some sort of human error. I don't know exactly why, but I never really trust my measurements that I take from life and drop them down. I'm always trying to take my measurements by comparing them in the scene and then comparing them within my painting. And that way I find that there's a lot less human error for whatever reason. Now, I'm asking myself whether or not this is a good composition in the back of my head. And I have a feeling that it's just not. It's just not a good composition. I'm not actually focusing on the difference in the foliage, which is the thing I really want to focus on. So let's just reset. If this is going to be the top of the peak, I'll forget about this shadow over here on the left-hand side. And I'm going to try to reset using the fact that I know this will be the water line and this will be the top peak somewhere with these trees, because I want to focus in on the interesting things that are happening with these little bits of yellow and the rhythms in here. That's what I really want to make my painting on. I think earlier I was trying to squeeze too much in, and that was not helping with the focal idea behind this painting. So if this is here, there's a big shadow of these tree lines. It goes all the way to the right here. And there's going to be a big mass. And then looking for some alignments, if I hold out and I find some angles, I find that there's a big shadow, starts about here, and it angles down in this sort of an angle. Right now with my brush, I was holding my brush up in this sort of way, and I was paying attention to where this line would have crossed, how big of a shape it would have left. And so that's what I'm focusing on to help find these masses right now. Sometimes this sort of freehand drawing is really hard to pull off. So if you guys are not that experienced with drawing, it's always better to start with a few minutes and to just draw things in. But here, if you get to a certain point where you're comfortable with drawing, then it can save you a lot of time to just jump right in. So drawing is one of the essential first steps in any painting, but finding our color relationships, our masses, is another important part. At the beginning of any painting, what we want to always do after we've established our drawing is we want to establish our lightest light, our darkest dark, and our largest masses. In this case, the largest masses are the greens of the mountains and the sky. The greens I have put in almost as a placeholder value. I think I'm going to have to adjust those colors of that eventually. But for now, on the start, I want to get more of my relationship going. Oftentimes, it's very helpful to have the sky indicated to be able to key off of it. One of the things we could see right now clearly is the color gradient of the sky. We can see how that sky is nice and light and hazy and a bit more orangish and neutralized at the bottom. And at the top, it gets a lot darker. But anyway, I want to tackle the sky for a second reason. Tackling the sky right now is gonna help me draw back in to my painting and make a bunch of drawing fixes. But then it's going to let me go and paint back over the sky. And one of the important things that we always have to keep in mind when we're painting is this concept of overlapping our paint and working back to foreground. When we overlap our paint, when we have the middle ground overlapping the background and the foreground overlapping the middle ground, everything in the oil paint is physically covering the layers of paint that are representing the physical depth in the space that we're looking at. If we have a thick impasto of sky that's cutting into a tree in the foreground, that's going to break up the effect of depth and distance that our paint is actually developing for us. So there are a number of things that I'm doing right now as I'm blocking in the sky. I'm fixing the drawing. I am establishing my color relationships, but then I'm also establishing the deepest zone of this painting. And it's going to set me up to be able to keep working and keep adjusting it going into the painting. One of the things that we need to be careful of, that it can be a common mistake that I see a lot of people making. A common mistake is that people squeeze the sky gradient too much too fast. If you actually think about how much of the sky I'm actually painting in this scene, this distance is just, it's a little bit more than a third of the height of this mountain. How many degrees is that actually of our vision of the zone of the sky? Because we can think about the dome of the sky in a circle. We have one end over there and 180 degrees over there. 90 degrees is above us. How many degrees above the horizon are we actually seeing of the sky? This might be in the ballpark, single digits, maybe about only 5 degrees. So we don't have that much variety within the sky, and we don't want to overdo it, but we don't want to paint it flat either. So at this point, I'll take the pile that I've mixed with my palette knife and I'll add just some pure cobalt blue, and I'll find a mixture in between, and then I'll work that in from the top. And so first, long strokes across. Then when I'm blending it in, I can work in these short vertical strokes. And I can let a little bit of the ground show through. It's always a nice little touch often. That's pretty good for the sky for now. I think maybe I'll go back in and touch it, but I think the sky, just that simple mixture of cobalt, ultramarine, white, a little bit of cat orange, a little bit of viridian at the end when I realize that it needs a little bit more pop of color. That is working just well. When we're out here working from nature, the big struggle is seeing all those values in real life and how do we compress them. One thing that we can do is we can squint and observe in our periphery. So when I pay attention to the sky and I'm looking and focusing at the sky right in here, and out of my periphery, how much contrast do I see within these green masses? I see it as being a relatively unified field. And so I'm gonna try to capture that. So I think some of these greens need to be a little bit lighter. And I'm going to try to distinguish difference in these various trees and just make sure to cover the painting. The nice thing about using a toned canvas is we don't have to cover all the tiny little white dots that can really get on my nerves, but I think this will have to be it for the day. This idea, the last thing I'll talk to you guys about this idea of my basic premise in painting if you guys have watched the mental representations lecture, is that first, we don't have any tools at our disposal to even know how to begin to paint or draw realistically. When we learn to draw, we're often in a very naive setting. So we're doing, stick figures, spaghetti hair, the typical kindergartner type of drawing that we might see. Eventually, we start to get to a point where we can start learning very analytical forms of drawing, measuring, looking at shapes, triangulating, finding horizontals, finding alignments, these sorts of things. They're being very specific and measuring things. Eventually, the highest level that I know so far of painting is a more intuitive approach where we're not necessarily asking ourselves to find like a one chunk of information at a time, but we're using our brain in a slightly different way to take all this sort of information to achieve a whole new level of refinement in our painting. The way that is through feeling. It's through being able to observe a feeling within the scene, to be able to either observe the atmospheric perspective, to observe the feeling of the texture of the rocks compared to the sky, compared to the trees, compared to the water, to feel the way that the light is falling down on the scene, and to try to recreate that feeling within our painting. It's a very different type of game than looking for one bit of information at a time, because what happens is we're taking all these bits of information in all at once, and we're really going in on a much higher level of refinement. So that's the stage where this painting is at right now. It's sort of emerging out of the analytical block-in stage, and it's coming to a point where if I were to continue working on this painting, my guiding idea that I'd have in my mind is, does this feel the same way as the scene? That I can stand and observe and take all of that in and try to capture it in the painting. Something a friend once told me back in the academy, people that train to spot currency forgeries, they never train on the forgeries. They only train on the real thing. They get to know the real thing as well as they can. And then when they come across a forgery, they know that something's just not right. So in our paintings, what we're trying to do is we're trying to take in the real thing as well as we can. Hopefully, we can take our painting that direction. We might not always get there. That's fine. It's in the striving towards it that we can get to some other interesting places. That's one of my biggest ideas about what it is that we're doing when we're painting realistically, and how do we get to a really high level. And when I've looked at critiques that artists would give in the past to students when they'd be teachers, famous artists like John Singer Sargent or Jean Leon Jerome, they would talk about the feeling of the construction of the figure, the feeling of the atmosphere, the feeling of air, the feeling of light. From my perspective, what I think they mean by that is this more intuitive way of painting after we have a solid foundation in the analytical. A good painting is really made or broken by its composition. When starting any plein air painting, we really need to ask ourselves what our painting is going to be about. After we know what our painting is about, some careful drawing will help us actually capture that within our picture frame and make sure the placement is good. And if it's not good the first time around, then we shouldn't be afraid to make the necessary changes to get it right before we go ahead and finish a mediocre painting. After drawing composition, then comes color. We need to simplify the entire scene into the large masses of color first, and that will help us capture the light in the scene. And after we've nailed down these fundamentals of composition, drawing, color, then we can switch into higher modes of thinking to really capture our subject. And it's not just higher modes of thinking, but even higher modes of feeling our object, trying to feel what's there and to recreate the same feeling within our painting. These clips are from a 70-minute long tutorial that is on my Patreon, and so if you want to watch the full-length video of the entire painting process where I go more depth in the drawing and also color mixing and a lot more, that's on there, as long as a lot of other tutorials. And I also do a few in-person workshops throughout the year, and there's a mailing list so you don't miss any news on that. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.